Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be covering my top 10 5-player board games. These are the games that I find to be the best choices available for when you have exactly 5 people at the table. We're not talking about 4 players. We're not talking about 6. Specifically, we're targeting the 5-player count. So without any further ado, let's get straight to the list. My number 10 5-player board game of all time is King of Tokyo, designed by Richard Garfield and published by Yellow Games. And this game, it's a fun little kind of a attack-heavy game where players are representing different monsters who are trying to vie for control over Tokyo. And Tokyo is represented by 1 space. However, at the 5 or higher player counts, there are 2 spaces that occupy Tokyo. You got Tokyo and Tokyo Bay. So 2 monsters or players can occupy Tokyo at a time. But all the other players are on the outside looking in. And Tokyo gives you certain benefits, certain advantages, but it also gives you some restrictions. For example, if you're in Tokyo, you're going to score victory points for every time you start your turn in Tokyo, already in Tokyo. Also, there's some limitations because if you're in Tokyo, you can never heal your character because your character has a certain amount of health. It starts at 10 and it diminishes and sometimes increases throughout the game. But if your character is ever knocked to 0 health, then you as a player are eliminated from the game and you'll be watching everybody else having all the fun. So you're factoring all that in. And basically, this is a game kind of like Yahtzee. You're rolling 6 dice and you get up to 3 rerolls, and all the faces of the die benefit you in different ways. First of all, your claws are very helpful because your claws help you attack every opponent that's not in the location you're in. So if you're in Tokyo, for example, you would be attacking all the players that are outside of Tokyo. However, if you're outside of Tokyo, you would be attacking all the players that are in Tokyo. So factoring all that in is very important. And again, if you eliminate all opposition, you will be the victor of the game. But there's another way about going this game, which is why I really enjoy it, because if you're not really that aggressive, attack-heavy type of person, you can win this game good old Euro fashion style, because the first player to get to 20 victory points also would win the game. So if you could get to 20 victory points before anybody else eliminates the rest of the opposition, you are going to win this game as well. And one of the ways you get victory points is by rolling these 6 dice that I mentioned, and 3 of the sides of the dice have number values on them, 1, 2, and 3. And if you ever roll 3 of a kind of any of those numbers, you're going to score the corresponding amount of points. 3 1s will score you 1 point, 3 2s will score you 2 points, 3 3s will score you 3 points. And for every additional die that matches that trio, that 3 of a kind, you'll score an additional point. So that's another way that you can go about winning the game. And again, if you start your turn in Tokyo or on Tokyo Bay, you get a few additional points as a reward. And factoring all these things in is such a cool and neat idea. I find that at the 5-player count is when this game really starts to sing. This game is okay at 3 or 4 players. It's functional at 2 players, but 5 or maybe 6 is really the way to go. My number 10 5-player board game of all time, King of Tokyo. Now we move on to my number 9 5-player board game of all time, and that is Puerto Rico by Andreas Seyfarth and Rio Grande Games. This is a classic, legendary game at this point. It has secured its status within the board game industry and the hobby. And this game here, it consists of variable phase order at the beginning of each round, where players are each going to take turns choosing these different characters, these different roles. And all of these roles are going to grant a specific action for all of the players around the table. However, the player who chose that action is going to get a bonus additional action as a reward for having chosen that action. So that's a really cool thing to factor in. So you want to choose the actions and time them to when it's to your convenience, when it's going to benefit you the most. You don't want to choose a role that's going to benefit the players around the table more than you. And sometimes you're going to be forced and pushed into those situations where you might have to choose a less than favorable action. But for the most part, you want to control your destiny, and you want to make sure that you select these things and time it accordingly so that you can reap its rewards. And the reason why this game is so cool at 5 players, there's an official 2-player variant for this game, so you can play as low as a 2-player count. But once you get to that maximum 5-player count, there's so many different things. First of all, you have additional ships that are available for cargo, for shipping, to gain victory points. You also get to milk in more of these different roles. More of the roles become available, and more of them get carried out during each specific specific round. Just really, really cool. You get to do a lot. You get to build that little engine a little bit quicker at the 5-player count, and it's just so much more competitive, it feels that way. Sometimes when you play a 3-player game, sometimes, not always, it could feel a little lopsided. It could feel like one player gets to a really quick advantage, but I feel that at a higher player count, the game kind of self-corrects and self-balances, and it becomes a very challenging experience thinking through all of those single rolls, because someone on the table is going to have a really good turn for that roll that you just finished picking. My number 9 5-player board game of all time, Puerto Rico. And now we move on to my number 8 5-player board game of all time, and that is Sheriff of Nottingham. And this game is a really cool game, which the skeleton of the design is really just a simple set collection. You're trying to collect sets of different goods. You have apples, and you have bread, and you have cheese, and you have chicken. And all of these score you points in different ways. You're going to score points for each individual one you have in your possession at the end of the game, but you're also going to score a majority and a secondary at the end of the game. So there's a little bit of a majority game going on. However, the heart of the game, the meat of the game, is really the bluffing that takes place, because each round, one player is going to take on the role of the evil, wicked sheriff. And that sheriff is trying to make sure that nobody sneaks into town with illegal goods. So first of all, you have these contraband goods that have red borders around them, and they score you additional points. But if you get caught trying to bring them into town, into market, then the Sheriff of Nottingham is going to penalize you, and you're going to have to pay some of your money to whoever the player who's controlling the sheriff that round is. Also, you can only bring one good of a type, so you cannot mix 2 legal goods even, like cheese and apples, for example. But you can try to sneak in a few of those goods, mix and match them, and hope that the Sheriff of Nottingham does not call your bluff. And there's some bribing taking place. You could always pay the sheriff to try to not open your bag, to not check your bag. However, if the sheriff sees that you bribe them, they might consider or see that you're suspicious. You could always bribe the sheriff to open someone else's bag. Really, really cool. Each player takes 2 turns being the sheriff, and that triggers the end of the game. And I just find that at the 5-player count, this game is just so amazing. First of all, it makes the game a little longer, because again, one of the conditions is to have each player go around twice. So at a 4-player count, you're going to get a few less opportunities to go to market than you will at a 5-player count. But also, it's just neat because there's so much more to factor in. As the sheriff, you really have to consider everything that's going on. And chances are somebody is lying to you. Someone is bluffing because there's 4 other people around the table trying to bring something to market. But once you fail and pay the price calling someone's bluff and they told the truth, you might have to think twice before challenging someone else. Really cool. Again, just a fun game at any player count. But I do think that the 5-player count, this game truly shines. My number 8 5-player board game of all time, Sheriff of Nottingham. My number 7 5-player board game of all time is Port Royal, the pirate-themed nautical press your luck game, which I find to be such an enjoyable experience. First of all, I love the way they combine press your luck with some really neat strategy, because you are managing these different character cards that are your victory points at the end of the game, but they also usually grant you special in-game bonuses, in-game advantages and abilities, and you're managing all that as much as you can. And you're factoring in every time you press your luck, the odds, and you're also trying to mitigate it, because, for example, you get these different cards that have sword symbols that allow you to repel your ships, because your ships are the cards that allow you to bust. You're trying to flip over as many ships as possible. The more ships are available in the tableau, the more ships you can basically loot for their money. However, if you ever draw a second ship of the same color, then you've busted and your turn is over. But again, these sword cards on your characters, they allow you to mitigate and repel some of these ships to continue and prolong your turn. But some ships are so difficult, they're so powerful, they're insurmountable, so you really got to factor all that stuff in. But what's really cool about this game at the 5-player count is that this game allows for every player to theoretically have an opportunity to join in on the active player's turn. So when you have a 5-player count, there's just going to be more opportunities for people to join in other players' turns. So by the time they get back to their turn, there's a possibility that they've done a lot. They've gone around the table 4 or 5 other times, and lots of other things were done in the meantime. So I just find that to be really, really cool. Just factoring all these things in. Again, it adds to the challenge of the gameplay. It adds to the missions. There's some missions or objective cards that players are trying to accomplish. And when you know that there's a few additional people racing for that same mission or those same missions, it just enhances the challenge. My number 7 5-player board game of all time, Port Royal. My number 6 5-player board game of all time is Kingsbury. And for those who watch this channel, you might know that I really love this game, and it's very likely that I enjoy this game more than some of the games that are ranked higher on this list. But for the purposes of this top 10, the 5-player board games, I had to give this game the number 6 spot. This game is a worker placement game, dice placement game, where your workers are dice, and basically the board consists of a grid with all the different spaces representing different characters in the court, the royal court, all the way from the top to the king and the queen, to the bottom, the court jester, and all the characters in between. You got your generals, your wizards, your blacksmiths, your scribes, all these different characters that help you in diverse ways. And notably, the main way that they help you is by providing you resources, namely wood, gold, and stone. Those are the main primary resources for building. And also, they grant you additional abilities like perhaps dice mitigation tokens, victory points, or maybe even the strengthening of your military. Because that's very important, because at the end of each year, the end of each round, at the winter season, you're going to be attacked. Your part of Kingsbury is going to be attacked by a horde of fantastical creatures, and you're going to suffer some casualties if your military is not strong enough. So you got to factor that in. But it's really, really cool because you're using these dice, and according to the dice, you're placing the dice on the spots in order to activate those actions and get those benefits. And sometimes you might have to place 2 or even 3 dice in order to get a more coveted, valuable spot. And at the 5-player count, it just becomes a really tight experience, which I can appreciate because those spots, those coveted spots, become even harder to come by. And sometimes you find yourself in a real tight situation because there's so many other people competing and combating for where you are trying to go. And all of a sudden, it makes the dice mitigation even more valuable. It makes those tokens more valuable. Really, really cool. You got some neat city building going on in this game. But at the 5-player count, again, that board becomes really, really tough to maneuver through. And I personally can really appreciate that. My number 6 5-player board game of all time, Kingsbury. And now we move on to the top 5, the cream of the crop. My 5 absolutely favorite board games to play when I have exactly 4 other people to play with. My number 5 5-player board game of all time is Colosseum, designed by Wolfgang Kramer and Marcus Lupke. And this second edition here by Tasty Minstrel Games just came out a few years ago. This game was originally printed by Days of Wonder, went out of print for quite some time, and then Tasty Minstrel brought it back into print and into circulation. And this game here is an auction bidding game where players each are running their own Colosseum. And they're putting on performances. Basically, they're drafting different events throughout the game. And these are based on real historical stories and scripts and events that were really carried out in ancient Roman times. And basically, each of these different events has a certain requisite, a certain requirement of resources, represented by tokens, that players have to accrue throughout the game in order to not only pull out these performances, but to score as many points as possible, to get as many spectators to view them. And that's exactly what the game is all about, getting spectators to watch your events. Every choice you make along the way, from getting additional seats, from winning the favor of different politicians, all of these decisions are made in order to get as many spectators to watch your events, because the spectators who watch your events is the equivalent of your victory points. And one of the really cool things about the game is that although it plays over the course of 5 rounds, you only score at the end of the game for your highest round, which more often than not is round number 5. You want it to be round number 5. You want to build up for that round to be the best. But sometimes it might be your 4th, maybe even your 3rd. You probably didn't win if it's your 3rd. But yeah, so it's really, really cool to factor that all in. So it's really hard to run away with this game as far as a runaway leader, because every player theoretically has a chance come round 5 to put on their best performance and hopefully take the victory, even if they did poorly on some of the previous rounds. So it's really, really cool in that regard. But the cool thing, what makes this game better at a 5-player count, is that the auction phase in this game the amount of auctions that happen is all based on the player count. So the more players that there are in the game, the more opportunities there will be for auctioning, which means that there will be a richer economy. More tokens will be possessed, which will not only again improve the auction phase, but it will also improve the trade phase, because this game includes a trading phase where players can interact and negotiate and barter with one another in order to interchange resources and or money. So this thriving, richer economy will also make the trading phase of this game much more interesting. And this game just has lots going on for it. But again, at that 5-player count, just having that richer economy, more tokens available, more things for players to discuss and negotiate during the trading phase makes this very much a cool 5-player game. My number 5-player board game of all time, Colosseum. And now we move on to my number 4. And I don't have the box of number 4 with me right now, but I do own the game. It's somewhere. And my number 4 5-player board game of all time is Kiklades. And Kiklades is, first of all, Kiklades is one of my favorite games of all time. I actually just recently played it at a 5-player count for the first time. I have mostly played it at 3 and even 2 players, and I've seen the weakness of this game at a 2 or 3-player count. I still enjoyed it because I enjoy the mechanisms and I enjoy the theme. But at a 5-player count, this game absolutely sings. It just becomes such a cooler, tighter experience. First of all, the board opens up more because you have a bigger board to accommodate the 5 players. But there's so much stuff going on. And even though geographically speaking, certain players within that group of 5 may not necessarily interact with each other, you always have to keep in mind that there's 4 other people on the table contending for that victory. And you got to factor that all in at the beginning of each turn, because at the beginning of each turn, you are participating in an auction, basically, winning the favor of the different pantheon of gods. And based on who you want to win with, you get that god and his tile, and that tile grants you certain abilities. It grants you some buildings that you need to buy in order to achieve the end game condition, which is to build a metropolis, or 2 metropolises, I should say. It grants you some additional resource, either land troops or naval ships, or it grants you priests, which will make auctions in the future cheaper for you, or it grants you philosopher cards, which is another way you can get a metropolis. So all of these gods in the pantheon have a different advantage, but you have to factor in what your opponents around the table might need, because as the game progresses and some of these players are closer to getting their second metropolis, you really want to think, do I want to win over the favor of Ares? Yes, Ares is something that would be very helpful to me, but if I allow, Joe Schmo to my left to win over the favor of Athena, it's very likely that once he drafts Athena, he's going to win the game. So you got to really, really consider what you're doing and what all the players around the table are doing. It just becomes such a more challenging experience at the 5-player count. Also, at the 5-player count, all the gods are always available at each round, because in the lower player counts, not all of the 5 gods of the pantheon are available. You always shuffle them and only some of them are available. In the 5-player count, all the gods are always going to be available. The order that they appear on the track, in the turn order track, is not always going to be the same. That's going to be randomized from turn to turn, but at least you know that Ares will be available next round if you really, really want him, or that Zeus will be available the next round if you really want him. At the lower player counts, you might have to wait every other turn or so to see some of these gods. So again, everything really, really improves at the 5-player count, which is why Kiklades is my number 4 5-player board game of all time. My number 3 5-player board game of all time is El Grande, designed by Wolfgang Kramer and Richard Ulrich. And here I have the big box, which includes 5 expansions for this game. And what I'm about to say for El Grande actually typically applies for all area majority games. Area majority games are always better at higher player counts, I find. You always want to play these with more people contending for those different areas, especially a game like El Grande, which grants secondary and tertiary benefits for the players according to the player count, right? In order to even tap in to the tertiary benefits of all the different areas here, you have to play at least at a minimum of 4 players. If you're only playing 3 players, then only the secondary benefits are even available. So you want to play at least at 4. And again, when you're playing with 5, it's even more challenging. Also, when you're playing with 5 players, then all of the action cards in the game are played each round, because each round you have 5 different action cards available, and they have different rankings from 1 through 5. Some of the higher ranked cards can provide more troops, or not more troops, but more caballeros, the different meeples that you place on your areas. Some of the lower valued cards provide fewer amount of meeples or caballeros, but they provide some cooler benefits or powers that you can activate for that turn. And each round, if you're playing a 5-player game, all 5 of those cards are going to get played. So it's really, really cool. And it makes the auction for turn order even more significant, because there's an auction for the turn order at the beginning of each and every single round. And if you factor in that you might potentially be 5th if you bid too low, you don't want to be 5th. You don't, because you're not going to have a choice. You're going to have to play whatever card is left over at that point. So again, it just makes the auction so much more significant and valuable, because when you're playing a 3-player game, if you're 3rd in the auction bidding, you might not mind as much, because the 3rd best card available from those action cards might be good enough for you. Or you might consider what you consider to be the best card was not necessarily what someone else considered to be the best card. So it still might be available for you come your turn. So again, the auction for turn order is not as significant. Yes, you probably want to get 1st or 2nd a few times throughout the game, but it's not as essential. It's just too much to pass up. You want to try your best to at least be top 3, top 4. You do not want to be last and not have a choice. So again, all the aspects of gameplay, from the auction to the control of the actual areas and unlocking those additional benefits for tertiary amounts or tertiary majority. Also the Castillo, which has a secret amount of meeples dumped in by each of the players. That becomes much more interesting, because it becomes even harder to play the memory game of remembering exactly how many caballeros have been dumped into that thing by the scoring round, because there's 4 other players that you have to factor in when you're trying to remember how many caballeros are in there. So many really cool, neat things going on in this game, and that's why it's my number 3 5-player board game of all time, El Grande. And now we move on to my number 2 5-player board game of all time, and that is Shadows over Camelot, designed by Bruno Cathala and Ludovic Mablanc, and published by Days of Wonder Games. This game has a King Arthur theme, where all the players take on the role of King Arthur or one of his Knights of the Round Table, and they're all going on different quests, sometimes collectively as a group, sometimes they're going individually, and each of these different quests has a different requirement in order to successfully meet its demands. And usually it's some type of card play, turn-by-turn card play, that resembles a little bit of poker, right? Some of these quests require a straight. You have to have a sequence of cards numbering from 1 through 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you got to play it in order, turn by turn. First, you got to play the 1, then the 2, and the next turn, and then the 3. Some of these locations require for you to have 2 different pairs, or 3 different pairs, or maybe even a full house, 2 of a kind and 3 of a kind. And again, you're doing all of this in order to accomplish the different quests. And every time you successfully accomplish a quest, you get a white sword, which you put on the round table. But every time you fail at a quest, you get a couple of black swords, which you put on the round table as well. And basically, you're trying to, at the end of the game, have a majority of white swords on the round table. It's really cool because it adds a trader mechanism. You have the potential for a trader. We always play with the potential, so there's no guarantee. You might be playing with all innocent players, all loyal players, and you're just wrongly accusing one another. But if there is a traitor, the traitor could be very detrimental to the team and their objectives, because this game is a hard game to beat even when there is no traitor. And when there is a traitor, it becomes even more challenging. And that's the thing about this game and why it shines at a higher player count, because first of all, once you get to a 5-player count, there's so many more of these quests that you guys can collaborate on or individually work on. When you have 3 players or 4 players, there's less of the board that you can cover. Also, it's more likely for you guys to double team on a particular quest, or maybe even triple team on a particular quest. It just increases your chances as a player. Also, you have some cards that benefit some action cards that you play that benefit all the other players. Let's say you're the active player, you play a card and it could benefit all the other players. Well, guess what? If there's more other players, then that's more players that will get benefited. So it's really good for the economy of the game. More cards get into the game that are helpful for the heroes, for the good guys, for the characters to win this game. Also, when you're playing at a 5-player count, the trader mechanism starts to become more interesting because it becomes a little bit easier for the trader to kind of go under the radar because there are 4 other people that may or may not look just as suspicious as him or her. So again, everything about this game just increases in value at the higher player count. I feel like maybe even 6 or 7 might even be better than 5 players. But once you get to 5 players, this game really, really starts to sing. That's why it's my number 2 5-player board game of all time, Shadows over Camelot. And now we move on to the top one, the cream of the crop, the very best 5-player board game of all time. And for some people watching, they might not be surprised. Moreover, they might even be disappointed. My number 1 5-player board game is Cosmic Encounter. I love this game, guys. And this game is my big group game. And by big group, I mean 5 or 6 players. I don't bring this out at a 10-player party game night. But at 5 players, this game is really good. I mean, first of all, this game needs a minimum of 3 players to play. I think one of the old editions, Avalon Hill or Mayfair, allowed for Cosmic Encounter to play at 2 players. I'm not sure how that would work. I'm not sure if I'd be interested, but the truth is, I'm not even interested at playing this game in 3 players. I've never played this game at a 3-player count. And quite frankly, when I play this game at 4 players, I'm kind of a little bit meh about it. I play it, I like it, I love the game, so it's just another excuse to play Cosmic Encounter, but I'm not really excited. But once I get this game at 5 players to the table, I am so excited about this game. That's when this game really starts to open up. The opportunities for alliances become really interesting because you can have 2 players team up against 3 players, or perhaps you can have 2 and 2 and then 1 a rogue solo Lone Ranger type playing all by himself. You can have 3 people competing against 2 different Lone Rangers. There's so many different opportunities for alliances and for betrayal once you hit that 5-player count. And also just the variety of the amount of aliens and how they interact with each other. Because one of the coolest things about this game is the different alien races. Each player has an alien race that grants them asymmetric abilities at the beginning of the game for every turn. And these asymmetric abilities are so different. They're different ways of basically bending or tweaking the rules of the game, even breaking them sometimes. And they're very particular to different phases of the game or different actions within the game. And again, the way they combine with one another and contrast with one another is such a neat thing to experience. You know, sometimes you see a character and you've played with that character before, but you've never played with that character while another particular character is in the game. And even that changes it. So again, once you get to a 5-player count, there's just more races to interact with. And also, once you get to a 5-player count, I also feel that it keeps the game in balance. It makes comebacks more likely. You can kind of fall under the radar once there's a 5-player count and really find a way to make a comeback because all of the stronger players don't consider you too much of a threat, so they might let you tag along for some of their victories, and that's a way of subtly getting back into the game. Really cool game, so much fun. Again, at the 5-player count, the opportunities for alliance and betrayal and interaction between the races is such a rich experience, which is why Cosmic Encounter is my number 1 5-player board game of all time. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here at When Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below and tell me which is your favorite game to play when you have 5 players at the table. Also, comment down below and tell me which of these games you feel like does not quite meet the mark as far as a 5-player game. I'm interested in reading what you guys have to say. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming.